No matter how many productivity books you read, no matter how many self-help books you read, everybody I know that works a hectic life, tries to be hyper-productive, is constantly distracted, flitting from one thing to the next to the next. And it's as if the corporate world is its own worst enemy, isn't it? Because when I was working from home during the pandemic and still working a corporate job, most of the senior leadership team never had any time to do any work because they were always call to call to call to call. So how are you going to get the best out of an individual if they never have any time to sit down and apply themselves to one task? And I think that's the real crux of what you explore within the book, and the real solution that I'm hoping it will provide in the long term is helping people understand that spinning a million in one plate is only useful if you can spin one plate at a time and give it your devoted, undivided attention to then go on to the next.
Well, there's loads of things in what you just said, but I'm just thinking, how old are you, Fergus? Can I
I'm
ask?
25,
Right, so I'm just thinking about that. So since you've done your A levels, is about what, 7 years, six
eight
years?
years ago, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, so even in those 8 years, I think there's lots of things that have happened, but a lot of the factors. So there are 12 fact. I learned from the incredible scientists I interviewed all over the world, from Moscow to Miami, from Rio to New Zealand, that there are 12 factors that can boost or harm your attention, as I mentioned before. And um, I think there's lots you've got to, and I think there's two levels at which we've got to understand this and respond to this. There's the ways we can understand it at the level of an isolated individual, right? There's all sorts of things we can do as individuals, and then there's things we have to do together collectively as groups to stop the things that are fucking up our attention, right? So it's like someone's pouring itching powder on us all the time. So I'll give you a kind of example. I think really you've just described really well that the kind of science. I'll give you an example of the science behind it. So at MIT, Massachusetts Institute of Technology, I interviewed one of the leading neuroscientists in the world, a man named Professor Earl Miller. And he said to me, look, you've got to understand one crucial thing about the human brain. You can only think consciously about one thing at a time. This is just a fundamental limit of the human brain. It's been there for 40,000 years in that way. The human brain hasn't changed in 40,000 years significantly. It ain't going to change anytime soon. You have this limit. You can think about one thing at a time. But what's happened is we've begun to tell ourselves a story that we can actually do many, many things at the same time. So we've told ourselves, in fact, a guy called Larry Rosen, a professor, discovered the average young person believes they can follow 7 forms of media at the same time. But what happens when you believe you're doing many things at the same time is actually, as Professor Miller explained, and as his science has shown, you're actually juggling, you're switching very rapidly between things. And that comes with a series of really big costs. So the first is called the switch cost effect. So let's say I'm talking to you now, Fergus. Let's say my phone, I don't know where it is, it's somewhere behind me. Let's say I just glanced at my text messages, right? You might think, oh, I can do that. 2 seconds, that'll take me 2 seconds to glance at my text messages and look back at you. But in the moment in which I do that, my brain has to refocus. Wait, what did Fergus just ask me? That takes a certain amount of mental power and energy, right? So that's the first cost in it. The first cost. The second cost is what's called what I would call a screw up effect, which is where when I do that, I'm going to make a mistake, right? Let's say I'm doing my tax return and I check my text messages. I go back to my tax return. I'm going to make mistakes. And then I have to go back and correct those mistakes. That takes more time, more mental energy. The third is about your memory. So to translate your experiences into memories takes a certain amount of brain power, right? And if your brain power is instead jammed up with what was just on Snapchat, what did that guy just say to me on WhatsApp? What's this guy on the TV saying? Oh yeah, oh, do they want me on the Zoom now? Yeah, what's going there? Oh, I've just got an email. If it's jammed up like that all the time, the evidence shows the more distracted you are, the less you will remember because you just don't have, your brain doesn't have the time to translate your experiences into memories. And the fourth way it really degrades your thinking is in terms of creativity. So when you have space to think, your brain will think back over things you've experienced, things people have said to you, things you've read, and it will start connecting them in interesting and original ways. That's what creativity is. But if you don't have the mental space to do that because you're switching, your creativity will significantly go down. And those might sound like small effects. I was struck by how huge they are. So to give you a couple of examples, Hewlett Packard, the company that make printers, they did a small study where they got a group of workers and split them into two groups. And the first group was told, just do your work and you're not going to be distracted or interrupted. And the second group was told, do your work, and then they interrupted them with emails and phone calls. So, slightly more than normal, but not some insane amount. And then they tested the IQ of both sets of workers. The workers who were being distracted scored 10 IQ points worse on the test. To give you a sense of what that means, if you or me got stoned now, if we just smoked a fat spliff together, our IQ would go down by 5 points. So chronic distraction is twice as bad for your ability to be intelligent and think clearly as getting stoned. You'd be better off sitting at your desk, smoking a spliff and getting stoned, but not being distracted, than sitting at your desk without a spliff being distracted all the time, right? There was another study at Carnegie Mellon University where they took 138 students and they split them into two groups and gave them an exam. And the first group did them under normal exam conditions, and the second group was told, you can you leave your phone on and you can receive text messages. And you'd think that'd make them do better because they could cheat, right? They could text people and ask them the answers. In fact, the people who were distracted by text messages did 20% worse on the exam than the people who were not distracted, right? We're all losing about 20% of our bandwidth by just being constantly interrupted. So there's that, and so that's both an individual and collective problem. But just to go back to think about collective solutions, so lots of people will hear this, right? And obviously I think most people will intuitively know this chronic distraction is not good for us. But also there can be an element where people hear someone like me saying this and they think, it's a bit like I've gone up to a homeless person in the street and said, you know what, mate, what would make you feel much better would be if you went to the Ritz over the road there and just had a really nice dinner. And the homeless person will go, yeah, you fucker, I know that. I can't do that, right? In a similar way, a lot of people will be hearing what I'm saying and a lot of the other things that we need to do to improve our attention and going, yeah, I can't do that, right? If I don't follow Slack, if I don't answer my boss, if I'm not on that Zoom, I'll lose my job. And that's why I think we need to make all sorts of changes that make it possible for people to do the things they know will improve their attention. I'll just give you one very brief example. In France in 2016, they had a big problem with what they called le burnout, which I don't think you need me to translate. And so the French government, under pressure from trade unions, set up a government investigation of it, led by Bruno Metling, who was the head of Orange, their biggest telecom company. And he discovered 35% of French workers felt they could never unplug. They had to have their phones on and not silenced all the time because their boss might contact them at any time of day or night and they would get, you'd be in trouble if you didn't respond. When I was a kid, the only people who were on call were doctors and the Prime Minister. Now, almost half the economy is on call, right? And it was really screwing people up. It meant they never rested. It meant they couldn't think clearly. And so the French government introduced a law called the right to disconnect. It's very simple. Just means you have a legal right to defined work hours, and you have a legal right that outside those work hours you don't have to check your email, you don't have to check your text, and you don't have to take work calls. So I went to Paris, that's been introduced, companies get fined. Rent-A-Kill got fined 70,000 euros because they were trying to get their staff to still respond to emails out of work hours, right? You can see how that frees people up to do the things they want to do. Because there's a real risk at the moment that telling people about these things makes them go, right, but I can't, I can do some of that, but it's really limited. We want to create social changes that can free people up to make the changes they want to make.